So in today's video, we're going to take on the question of whether it's possible to have a truly just ruler or a truly just government. Coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing. So politics, of course, is in a lot of the news nowadays. It's been in the news for quite a while and no doubt will be in the news a lot in the future. It's something that I think is on a lot of our minds. And one of the questions that some of us may wonder is what we might learn from the Buddha or from early Buddhism about a just government, about a good ruler. What makes a good ruler? Is it possible to have a good ruler? And in this channel, I like to look at some aspects of early Buddhism that are somewhat conflicted or confusing or difficult to sort of get our minds around. Because, of course, there's always also room for the easy stuff, which we also do treat, but I think it's good to also look at some of the more complicated issues, because there's some things that the Buddha, either him personally or at least early Buddhism, we find, there's a certain amount of complication involved. And so what we want to do today is sort of delve into some of that complication and get some of the flavor for the difficulties involved in justice, in just rulership, in having a just government. So in particular, there's one sutta where the Buddha is meditating, sort of musing to himself, and wonders. He wonders whether it's possible to have a just ruler, whether it's possible to have a just government. Is it possible, in particular, to have a ruler that doesn't have to kill, that doesn't have to confiscate things, that doesn't have to cause sorrow in the simple doing of his business? And when he's thinking this, Mara, who is the sort of personification of desire and attachment, comes to him and sort of goads him and asks him the same question. Well, that's a good question, he says. But you, Buddha, since you're a perfectly enlightened being, you can do anything. You could turn a mountain into gold, he says. That's what Mara says to him. So maybe you could be that sort of just ruler who doesn't have to kill and doesn't have to confiscate and doesn't have to cause sorrow. And the Buddha says to him, has a very interesting reply. The Buddha says to him that even if we gave a person 2 mountains of gold, they still wouldn't be satisfied. And he says, keeping that in mind, we should basically strive to be ethical and go forward in our lives, with that in mind. There are many, many levels on which we can look at this little dialogue between the Buddha and Mara. Number one, of course, is that Mara is being somewhat fanciful, that the Buddha could change a mountain into gold. Perhaps that's something that they actually thought the Buddha could do. More likely, it's a sort of a good story. Perhaps that it implies that the Buddha, being a very influential and powerful person of his day, if he wanted to, he could make a lot of money. If he wanted to, he could be successful. He could be powerful. The story is that when the Buddha was born, there was the question whether he was going to be a great king or a great holy person. And so the thought here, I suppose, by Mara is, well, look, he could still become a great king if he wanted to. He could still make a lot of money if he wanted to. But the Buddha here in a certain sense, changes the direction following Mara, changes the direction from thinking about just rulership into thinking about greed and desire and attachment to worldly things. And I think the upshot here is that on this view of rulership, of power, governmental power, let's say, it's an issue of greed. It's an issue of amassing power for oneself. It's the sort of thing that the Buddha seems to be saying you can only do if you're really interested in that kind of end. And this seems to imply that being a ruler, that rulership is itself inherently bound up in craving, in attachment, in greed, and perhaps in hatred as well. And that, of course, also implies that it's not really possible to be a just ruler. And we're going to get back to that as we go along. But there's also another passage in another sutta called the Aggañña Sutta, very famous sutta that talks sort of about sort of the arising of the world in a sort of a fanciful way also. It's a good story. But there's one point here where the Buddha describes the arising of kings within the context of the arising of the world. And he says that the kings arose due to what is dharma, that is what is good, and not what is adharma, or what is not good. So this implies that the arising of kings, the kings arose, or governments, or people in power, arose for good reasons. They arose for dharmic reasons. And so what we have here, sort of sketched out in a very rough sense, is a bit of a tension within early Buddhism between different views of rulership, between different views of just government. And the Buddhist scholar Stephen Collins has written a book where he deals with some of these issues. And in his view, basically in early Buddhism, what we have are two different, slightly different views of what dharma is, of what ethics is in this context. On the one hand, he calls it sort of the first sense of dharma. Dharma is what we might say, what we might term just reciprocity. That is, that people are punished appropriately for whatever wrongdoing they may have done. This is the sort of thing we have an idea of in our court system, where the intention is that people are punished justly for their crimes. That is, they're not punished too much, they're not punished too little, and they're punished appropriately, and that they've actually committed the crime that they're accused of. So that's the first sense of dharma. And the second sense of dharma is what we might consider a more sort of universal sense of dharma, where basically any form of punishment is itself a crime. Where punishment of any kind, where killing people, where punishing people, where confiscating things, where causing people sadness, as the Buddha said at the beginning of this, all those things are wrong to do. And so therefore, any kind of governmental action in terms of just reciprocity, in terms of punishment, is itself a problem, is itself, in a sense, criminal, is itself wrong. And of course, if we understand dharma, or justice, in the second sense, this more universal or more rigorous sense, then our only advice to kings would be, don't be a king. It's not really possible to be a just ruler. It's not really possible to fulfill the responsibilities of a ruler in a way that's just. There is, however, another possibility, a possibility sort of between these first two, if you like, which is the possibility of what's termed in early Buddhism the wheel-turning king. And there is a sutta in the Digha Nikaya in early Buddhism that talks about the wheel-turning king, the sort of righteous ruler. The sutta is really quite interesting in describing the arising of these righteous rulers and describing sort of what their rulership would be like, to give us an idea of kind of a utopian kind of rulership. And it's said that the wheel-turning king rules based on principle, which I take it we mean to distinguish between ruling based sort of on your whim or on arbitrary power. It's not simply that the king does whatever he wants to do, but rather that he rules based on principles, or maybe even we might say laws. Of course, this is written probably prior to, obviously it's certainly prior to our very, very detailed and expansive legal systems, but nevertheless, the idea is that he has principles that he's going to rule by. He's not simply going to be arbitrary in his will. It's also said that the ruler, a wheel-turning king, is going to provide protection and security to the people within his realm. He's going to provide protection and security both to people and to animals in the realm. It's also said that this just ruler is going to provide for the poor, so that the poor are not going to be destitute. And it's said that the wheel-turning king is also going to rely upon the wise people in his realm, the ascetics, the Brahmins, the other wise people, to help him to understand what is right and what is wrong. So that is, if he has questions, he's going to go to the wise people in the realm to try to figure out the answers about what the right thing is to do in a particular, let's say, complicated situation. It's also said that a ruler like this is able to conquer the lands around his kingdom simply by getting his army together and moving into the other land. Because once he's in there, the people in the other kingdom will simply accept him as their ruler as well, because presumably they see what a just and righteous person he is, and that they would prefer to be under his rule than their own, let's say. And once I've said this, we can begin to see the weaknesses here, because this is clearly not a very credible kind of history. It's a utopian history. It's a history that we might like to be true, but it's not one that we can easily see as fitting into what real humans are liable to do. And of course, we have to remember that this wheel-turning king is also said to be somebody who is able to provide security and safety to the people in his realm. That also implies, at least potentially, the use of violence, at least the readiness to use violence under certain circumstances, because in the case that he's not willing to do that, it's not clear how safety and security are always going to be provided, given that you will always have other kingdoms around that might wish, let's say, to encroach on the territory of the wheel-turning monarch. But in any event, this is supposed to be a history of the past, when one of these wheel-turning monarchs was around. It's a sort of a legendary history, let's say. And as the legendary history goes on, what happens is that every once in a while, I should back up and say that when the wheel-turning monarch becomes a wheel-turning monarch, there's said to be a number of treasures that are part of his monarchy. And one of these is called the wheel treasure. And this appears to be some sort of a magical, again, somewhat supernatural kind of thing. It's not an actual wheel. It's more of a kind of a heavenly apparition that makes clear the justice and righteousness of his realm. And it's said during this continuation of, let's say, his realm and the realm of his descendants, is that every once in a while this wheel disappears. And there's not given any reason as to why the wheel disappears, but it just does. And what happens is that in the descendants of this monarch, the ones who are the true wheel-turning monarchs then turn to the wise people in the realm and ask them what to do, what wise and just things need attention, and that they will tell him, and then he will do them, and the wheel will return. But again, it's said that after a time, there will be a monarch who, instead of going to the wise people in the realm, is going to just take it upon himself to try to figure out what the problem is. And that is when the downfall really accelerates, because once the king tries to decide for himself why the wheel has disappeared, being unwise, he simply does the wrong things. And in particular, it points to the fact that he stops providing for the poor. And so strife begins. There's more of a difference between rich and poor in the society. There's different kinds of strife. It gets quite complicated, the story does. And it's not really important for the purposes of this video what goes on, but basically society disintegrates. So I raise this because it is, I think, probably the closest thing we have in early Buddhism to a real kind of a picture of what a secular lay utopia would be like, of what a householder utopia in a normal world would be like. The story that we hear here is actually quite reminiscent of the story of King Ashoka, who I talked about in an earlier video. It's not clear to me whether the sutta of the wheel-turning monarch was actually composed after Ashoka, that is to say, with him in mind, as sort of like the template here, or if this is something that was actually composed before Ashoka's rule, and that Ashoka may have used himself as a template for his own rule. Which of those is true, I really don't know, and I'm not sure what the scholarship is on that. But in any event, it is similar in certain respects to Ashoka's own rule. That is to say, King Ashoka was a real ruler in ancient India, who began by being very violent, it is said, and then eventually took on Buddhism as his belief system, and became a pacifist, and set up all kinds of help for the poor in his community, and help for everybody. He used the treasure of the state to improve the roads, to provide food, to provide medicine, to provide for the health of both animals and humans in the society, and again to stop warfare. And as such, his rulership was really quite exceptional by the standards of anybody, but certainly by the standards of his day. That said, of course, after he passed on, that kind of ideal rulership really did not continue very long. It also is important to add to this that Ashoka also did, according to his own retelling and recounting in his stelae, these stone tablets on which he inscribed a lot of his history, he did punish people who did wrong. He had no problem with that kind of punishment, of that kind of just reciprocal punishment. He was very adamant that he wanted judges to rule impartially, and so he had a method of sort of keeping up with the judges to do that. So he clearly cared that it was done correctly. Nevertheless, he did certainly engage in punishment of people who broke the laws. It's also the case that we should always keep in mind he wrote his own history. I mean, the stelae that we have, which is basically all that we know about his rule, were written by him or by people on his direction. So we can't expect that they're going to be necessarily absolutely accurate as to what happened in his kingdom. What is clear is that's what he wanted people to think, and for all we know, he was being relatively accurate in his own history, but we don't know for sure. So, but the overarching problem with Ashoka, and that we saw in the story from the early texts, is that society just normally decays. It naturally decays. The wheel treasure may appear, but if it appears, it doesn't appear forever. It doesn't stay there. It stays there for a time, and every once in a while it was simply of its own disappear. It's a sort of a sense of entropy, if you like, that if we know the second law of thermodynamics, that all things tend towards entropy in the universe, that any kind of order tends to decay over time. That's the kind of view we get in this view of utopia, is that whatever kind of human utopias there might be, they don't persist forever. They can't. Now, also, it's important to look at another potential utopia, because when we're thinking about just rulership or a just government, we might say, well, but the Buddha himself, when he set up the Sangha, the early monastic order, he didn't set that up as a kingdom. He set it up as a kind of a rough democracy, where decisions were made, at least important decisions, were made communally, by vote, by a discussion and interrelation of people, rather than by a single person giving his orders. And so we might say, well, there's another general template of society in early Buddhism, which is a democratic template based on the Sangha. But there are a number of things need to be said about this. Number one, the Buddha never thought that the Sangha, or at least never said that he believed the Sangha was a sort of a perfect society. It's not the case that he was setting up a democratic kind of order within the Sangha for sort of Enlightenment, Lockean kinds of ideals. It wasn't like he was trying to create a society that would protect or guarantee certain kinds of human freedoms. That wasn't his intent. His intent of setting up the Sangha this way, insofar as we know, was basically to provide for a kind of communal harmony. That if everybody had a say in decisions, there would be a communal harmony. If decisions were taken together, that would promote a kind of communal harmony. He may have gotten this idea out of the Sakya clan, which may have been somewhat democratic, probably more oligarchical, but nevertheless they may have had some kinds of votes there in their group in India. And so it may have come from that kind of background, or from the Jain background, another religion at the time. It's not clear. In any event, what is true is that the Buddha didn't see that as a perfect society, and he never claimed that he wished the democratic ideals of the Sangha to be reflected in the greater lay or household or society around. He simply saw it as a method of getting the right things done at the right time in a kind of harmony in a small community where everybody knew everybody else. It's also important to add that the Sangha, of course, being pacifist, did actually rely upon the ruler, the king of the area, in order to protect them. So insofar as the wheel-turning king is somebody who protects his own subjects, Well, the Sangha would be part of that. The Sangha was protected by the king. And if there were people harassing the Sangha or people who didn't belong in the Sangha who were sticking around or making trouble, the Sangha would have had to rely on lay power, on the secular power of the government in order to do something about that, because they didn't have the power or the control to do that in their own land, being that they were a pacifist kind of non-military order, an order without any kind of military at the time. And the society in which a democracy, and I should say the early society, the ancient society in which democracy as a form of government reached its apex, would of course be ancient Greece. And in ancient Greece we have a lot of philosophers, people who actually originated philosophy in the West, who talked about democracy as a form of government. And in particular, Plato is perhaps the most famous, and Plato was very jaundiced about democracy, in particular because he saw how a democratic form of government in which really people did know each other, at least to a large degree in a small city-state like Athens, his own teacher, his own mentor, Socrates, was hounded by that society in which he was a part because he was a gadfly. He was somebody who was not easy to get along with. He was somebody who pointed out the hypocrisies of the people, the powerful and influential and just normal people around him. And as a result, he made plenty of enemies. And also, as a result, he was condemned on trumped-up charges of corrupting the youth, basically by making fun of people. And as a result, he was condemned to death, and eventually, he committed suicide based on that condemnation, because the democratic society of which he was a part was not willing to accept him. And this is another part of democracy that I think a lot of people overlook when they think of democracy as kind of a utopian kind of way of living. Democracies involve and can involve the tyranny of the majority, or even the tyranny of a minority insofar as it becomes oligarchical, which is in fact what we're seeing in the United States right now, is less of a democracy of any kind, whether it's representative or not, and more of an oligarchy. But even within a democracy, you have the problem of, if people don't like you, they can very well band together and democratically decide to do something very bad. We see this also in areas of the country or the world where societies break down, or perhaps where people in government are not willing to punish people. What do you have? You have lynch mobs. You have people on their own taking laws into their own hands. So it's very easy to go and say, we should construct a government in which where punishment is outlawed and where everyone attempts only to reform those who are criminals or who do bad things. That is perhaps a very wonderful ideal. The question is to what extent the wider society is willing to buy into that ideal. And I think history would show that at the very least you're going to have to do an enormous amount of work within the wider society to bring that ideal to fruition. Because if you don't, what's going to happen is people are going to be very disappointed that people aren't being punished, because that's simply the way so many humans think that justice has to be meted out, meted out as punishment. So the upshot of all of this is that being a householder is, in the Buddha's words, a dusty road. It's a road where we get ourselves, we necessarily, or at least with high probability, get ourselves involved in a lot of ethically questionable kinds of things. There are perhaps ways of doing it completely as it were by the book, or at least dharmically, in the second sense of being completely free of these problems, but they're very difficult. They're very, very difficult to maintain. And if being a ruler is kind of the apex of being a householder, it's being a householder with the most power and control and wealth and influence, it's going to be even worse at that place, because not only are you going to be a householder with the normal householder temptations and hatreds and dislikes, but you're going to also have the means very often to get what things you want and to deal with people that you don't like. This is also the idea of the mountain made of gold. You're going to be able to get that mountain for yourself, and the question is that going to be enough? Is it ever really enough? And the Buddha said that even if you had two, it wouldn't be enough. I mean, that is to say, power corrupts. Of course, we should have very high standards for our government. We should have very high standards for our rulers. We should hold them up to the highest standards of Dharma insofar as we can. But we should also take off the rosy glasses in the sense that we should realize that there are things that are difficult to maintain within ordinary society. And so there always are going to be trade-offs. There always are going to be compromises made within a real human society as opposed to an idealized one. And to an extent, it was the Buddha's willingness not to compromise, at least, I mean, he did compromise even with the Sangha around the edges, but his wish to keep the Sangha as little compromised as possible that made him wish to sort of retire it from normal social life. But I'd be interested to know, because this is a question clearly in which there are two different kinds of competing opinions within the early texts about justice. Do you think that it's possible to have a truly just government, a truly just ruler? Is it possible in a moment? Is it possible over any period of time? Is it possible to institute such a government in some way, if not permanently, then at least semi-permanently? I'd be interested in your thoughts. And if you're interested in discussions such as these about issues of early Buddhism, issues of Buddhism contemporarily around the web, take a look at my Patreon page. I try to put up stuff whenever I find it of interest that I think, and I put up a small sort of little description underneath, sort of my thoughts about it. And also thanks to my supporters over on Patreon, because it makes a great difference to me, a great deal of difference to me to have your support. And if you're coming back, if you're long-time viewers, welcome back. Glad to have you here. If you're first-time viewers, take a look at potentially subscribing. And again, love your comments and questions. Put them all down below if you have any things you would like to add. So thanks so much for being here. See you on the next one of these videos. Meanwhile, be well.